Let me be very clear about what happened in the early hours of this morning across 12 NATO installations stretching from the Baltic coast of Poland to the ammunition depots of Romania and the command architecture of the German operational theater. Because what you are going to hear on every network in the next hour is not the story. The story you are going to be told is about damage assessments, about alliance solidarity consultations, about Article 5 deliberations, about the appropriate measured response of a unified transatlantic community standing firm in the face of aggression. What it is not going to tell you is the single most important strategic fact embedded in what Russia did tonight, which is that this strike was not a military operation designed to destroy infrastructure. It was a demonstration designed to answer a question. The question was whether NATO's integrated air defense architecture can intercept a coordinated hypersonic salvo at the scale and geographic dispersion that Russian military planners have been designing toward for a decade. The answer, delivered tonight in fire and rubble across 12 separate coordinates from the Baltic to the Black Sea, is that it cannot. Having been inside the national security apparatus of the United States government for decades, having watched how these threshold decisions get made at the level where consequences outlast the administrations that make them, I can tell you with complete certainty that the planners who designed tonight's strike were not trying to win a war tonight. They were trying to establish a fact, and they have established it. Stay with me, because by the end of this analysis, you will understand something about what just happened that the institutional defense establishment in Washington is not prepared to say publicly and may not be prepared to say privately for another 72 hours. While they calibrate the language. 12 bases. The selection is not random, and I want you to understand the targeting logic because it reveals the strategic architecture underneath the kinetic event with a clarity that the damage assessment reports will not provide. Powid's Air Base in Poland, which serves as the primary pre-positioning site for American heavy equipment under the European Deterrence Initiative, storing approximately $4 billion in armor, artillery systems, and logistics material accumulated over years of patient buildup. Mihail Kogalnicianu Air Base in Romania, the logistics hub for Black Sea operations and the forward operating location closest to the Crimean coastline that matters for any NATO operational posture in the Eastern Theater. Rzeszów Jasionka, which has been the primary transfer point for weapons shipments into Ukraine for the better part of 3 years, handling billions of dollars in materiel that has sustained Ukrainian military operations. Ramstein in Germany, the command and control nerve center for all American air operations in the European theater, the node through which every major decision about European air defense flows. The targeting list, read in sequence, is not a list of military targets. It is a sentence. And the sentence it is writing says, we know where everything is, we can reach everything we know about, and the systems that were supposed to stop us did not stop us. That is the message. Everything else is context. The weapons that delivered tonight's strikes are the Zircon hypersonic cruise missile and the Kinjal air-launched hypersonic missile, operating in a coordinated salvo pattern that Russian military doctrine describes as a massed strike designed to overwhelm layered defensive systems through simultaneous multi-axis approach. The Zircon travels at approximately Mach 9. It flies at an altitude profile that defeats the lower-tier intercept envelope of Patriot PAC-3 batteries, which were designed against a different threat at a different speed. It maneuvers terminally in ways that the guidance systems of existing NATO surface-to-air missile batteries were not designed to track through their full evasive flight path. The Kinjal, launched from MiG-31K interceptors operating from Russian territorial airspace, approaches from vectors that were not covered by the sensor geometry of the air defense network as it was postured tonight. The combination of these two systems, operating simultaneously against 12 geographically dispersed targets separated by hundreds of kilometers, requiring a deconfliction and timing architecture of extraordinary complexity, tells everyone with serious military planning experience that what happened tonight was not improvised and was not rushed. It was rehearsed over an extended period, embedded inside exercises that were classified as routine large force training events and assessed by Western intelligence as such because the alternative conclusion was too uncomfortable to sustain institutionally. Most people stop here, and that is exactly why they miss what I am about to explain next. The air defense failure is not the story. The air defense failure is the evidence of the story. The story is about what happens inside NATO's Article 5 consultation mechanism in the next 12 hours, because what Article 5 actually requires, stripped of the political language that surrounds it in every public statement, is that each member state determine for itself whether an armed attack has occurred and what collective response is necessary and proportionate. That determination has never been tested against a scenario involving direct strikes on alliance infrastructure by a nuclear-armed adversary operating within the legal ambiguity that Russian planners have been deliberately cultivating. We are about to learn in real time what the alliance actually is, as opposed to what the alliance says it is in communiques issued from climate-controlled conference rooms in Brussels. Germany's defense minister will face a parliamentary consultation requirement that takes a minimum of 48 hours to generate a legal authorization for offensive military response of any meaningful scale. France's independent nuclear deterrent posture means that Paris makes its own calculation on timelines and under criteria that run through the Élysée Palace and not through NATO's integrated military command structure. The Baltic states, which have been the most vocally committed to alliance solidarity in the face of Russian pressure, are also the most geographically exposed to conventional Russian military power and the most dependent on rapid reinforcement that the logistics network just demonstrated it cannot guarantee under contested conditions where the pre-positioned equipment has been struck. Hungary's government has maintained a diplomatic posture toward Moscow throughout the Ukraine conflict that creates a structural fault line inside the alliance's political consensus mechanism at precisely the moment when consensus is most urgently required. These are not theoretical variables sitting in a planning document somewhere. They are the load-bearing walls of the Article 5 architecture, and tonight's strike hit every one of them simultaneously with a precision that tells you something important about how thoroughly Russian military planners have studied the internal political architecture of the alliance they are confronting. What comes next is where things take a serious turn, and this is the part that the institutional narrative will work hardest to contain. I want to present the strongest version of the Western response argument honestly, because intellectual honesty requires engaging with it seriously rather than dismissing it. NATO possesses overwhelming conventional military superiority in the aggregate across all measurable dimensions of force structure, logistics capacity, and defense industrial output. The alliance's combined GDP exceeds Russia's by a factor of approximately 25 to 1. American air power, if authorized for offensive operations against Russian military infrastructure, retains capabilities that would impose catastrophic and sustained costs on Russian military assets across the full depth of the Russian operational theater. The political solidarity of the alliance, while imperfect in the ways I have described, has demonstrated greater durability under sustained pressure than Russian strategic calculation predicted at the outset of the Ukraine conflict in 2022. The argument can be made that tonight's strike, by crossing a threshold that had previously been carefully observed, has simplified the political problem inside the alliance by removing ambiguity about Russian intentions and creating the conditions for a unified response posture that was previously politically unavailable. That argument is not without merit, and I want to be clear about that. And it is also not sufficient for the situation we now face, because the argument assumes that the response options available to the alliance exist within a political space that the nuclear dimension of this confrontation actually permits. It does not. Russia's nuclear doctrine, specifically the provisions governing the use of nuclear weapons in response to conventional attacks on Russian territory or conventional attacks that threaten the existence of the Russian state as a functioning political entity. Those provisions have been publicly revised twice in the last 3 years in ways that explicitly lower the threshold of nuclear employment below what American strategic planners were designing against during the Cold War. That is not a detail to be managed around. That is a civilizational constraint on response options, and it is the constraint that Russian military planners are counting on to operate as the ceiling above which Western response will not be permitted to rise regardless of the provocation. The economic dimension of what happened tonight will unfold over the next 30 to 60 days, and it will be as consequential as the military dimension in ways that will be less visible in daily news coverage. European energy markets will open tomorrow morning against the backdrop of a direct NATO military infrastructure strike by a nuclear power for the first time in the alliance's 75-year history. Insurance underwriters for maritime shipping in the Baltic and the Black Sea will reassess risk models overnight in ways that will compound into significant cost increases across supply chains that European economies depend on. The cost of European sovereign debt will begin to reflect the political uncertainty premium that financial markets apply when the security environment deteriorates in ways that governance structures were not designed to manage within their existing frameworks. German industrial output, already under structural pressure from energy costs that remain elevated since the Nord Stream disruption, will face an additional drag from the defense spending commitment that tonight's events will make politically unavoidable in ways that redirect investment from productive economic activity. None of these economic consequences will be visible in tomorrow's news coverage. All of them will be measurable in 6 to 12 months of economic data, and their aggregate effect on European political stability should not be underestimated by anyone who has watched how economic stress translates into political radicalization over the past 15 years. The historical framework through which serious analysts will eventually assess what happened tonight reaches back not to the Cold War, which is the comparison that every commentator will deploy in the next 24 hours as their primary reference point, but to a moment in 1956 that the Cold War comparison tends to obscure. In November of that year, the Soviet Union crushed the Hungarian uprising with direct military force at the precise moment that Western attention and Western military assets were consumed by the Suez Crisis in a different theater entirely. The lesson that Soviet strategic planning drew from 1956 and that Russian strategic planning has explicitly inherited and formalized is that the management of simultaneous crises across multiple geographic theaters can create windows of operational opportunity that would not exist if adversary attention and military resources were unified and focused. What I am telling you is that the 12 bases struck tonight were not selected only for their military value and their symbolic significance. They were selected for their role in the alliance consultation mechanism, and the timing of this strike, following by 9 days the escalation of Chinese naval operations in the Pacific theater, reflects a level of strategic coordination across authoritarian great powers that the Western analytical community has been reluctant to fully acknowledge. The world that existed before tonight, the world in which the deterrence architecture built after 1945 maintained its basic structural integrity through the combination of nuclear deterrence and conventional military presence and political will. That world does not exist this morning. What exists this morning is a world in which a nuclear-armed state has conducted direct kinetic attacks on the military infrastructure of a nuclear alliance, and the response options available to that alliance are constrained by the very nuclear dimension that was supposed to make such attacks unthinkable. This is not primarily a failure of American military capability, which remains formidable in absolute terms. This is a failure of strategic architecture, of the conceptual framework that was supposed to prevent this moment by making the cost of such action prohibitively high. And that framework failed, not tonight, but over the course of 15 years of decisions that chose the management of uncomfortable realities over their honest confrontation. We are paying that debt tonight. In Beijing, the assessment being conducted tonight is not about NATO directly. It is about the credibility of American extended deterrence commitments in the Pacific, updated by tonight's evidence about what happens when those commitments are directly tested. In Pyongyang, the evidence is being assessed in terms of what it reveals about the gap between American declaratory deterrence policy and operational deterrence credibility under conditions of genuine strategic pressure. In Tehran, the assessment is about response thresholds and the demonstrated distance between stated red lines and actual enforcement consequences. Every capital that has been calculating whether American security commitments retain operational meaning in the current environment is updating that calculation tonight, and the update is moving in the same direction across every capital that matters. If this analysis has helped you understand what actually happened tonight beyond the damage assessments and the diplomatic language, share it with someone who needs to understand what the institutional narrative is working to contain. Subscribe because the developments that follow in the next 72 hours will be as consequential as what happened tonight, and you need analysis that will not blink at the conclusions the evidence requires. Leave your assessment in the comments. Tell me whether you believe NATO's Article 5 mechanism will produce a unified response, and if it does not, what you assess the long-term consequence to be for every security commitment the United States has made to every ally on every continent. I read every comment. Stay informed, stay clear-eyed, because what was decided tonight in the skies over Poland and Romania will be discussed in history classrooms for 100 years, and the obligation to understand it belongs to everyone who takes the next decade seriously. Let me be direct about what the next 72 hours require from Western leadership, because the window for consequential decision-making is narrower than the consultation timelines that alliance political processes normally accommodate. The immediate operational priority is the 6 warships in the Black Sea, the logistics nodes that have been struck, and the air defense architecture that has just been demonstrated to be insufficient against the specific threat that was employed tonight. Each of those operational problems requires decisions measured in hours, not in the days and weeks that alliance political consensus mechanisms are designed to produce. The gap between the decision timeline the situation requires and the decision timeline the political architecture can produce is itself a strategic vulnerability that Russian planning has been studying and designing against. The deeper question, the question that will define whether the events of tonight represent a temporary crisis that the alliance manages and recovers from, or a structural inflection point that reshapes the European security environment permanently, is whether the political leadership of the United States and the major European allies has the capacity for the honest strategic reckoning that the situation demands. That reckoning would require acknowledging publicly that the air defense architecture is insufficient against the specific hypersonic threat that was employed tonight and committing to the investment and deployment timelines required to close the gap. It would require acknowledging the political fault lines inside the alliance consultation mechanism and making the structural adjustments needed to reduce their operational consequences. It would require, above all, an honest accounting of how 15 years of accumulated strategic choices produced the situation that arrived tonight. Because without that accounting, the same choices will continue to be made and the situation will continue to compound. I have been waiting for that reckoning for years. The events of tonight have made it unavoidable for anyone willing to face them honestly. The specific technical investments required to close the hypersonic defense gap are known. They are documented in program office analyses and in congressional budget justification documents. They include the development and deployment of directed energy intercept systems that can engage hypersonic threats at a cost per intercept that does not bankrupt the defender in an extended exchange. They include the development of distributed sensor architectures that eliminate the radar horizon limitations that tonight's attack exploited. They include investment in the offensive strike capabilities that provide an alternative to purely defensive responses by holding the launch platforms and the logistics chains that sustain hypersonic attack capability at risk. None of these investments are technically infeasible. All of them have been underfunded relative to the threat timeline because the political system has not been willing to make the case for them honestly to the public that ultimately funds them. Tonight changed the political calculus for that argument in ways that may finally create the conditions for the honest conversation the situation has required for a decade. What I genuinely do not know, and I want to be direct about the limits of my analytical confidence here, is whether the political leadership currently in place in Washington and in the major European capitals has the capacity to lead that conversation with the honesty and the strategic seriousness it requires, rather than managing it into a framework of controllable crisis that allows normal political operations to resume as quickly as possible. What I know is that the 24 to 72 hour window following a shock of this magnitude is the period during which the strategic decisions that define the long-term response get made or fail to get made, and that the consequences of decisions made or avoided in that window persist for decades. This is that window. The obligation to fill it with serious thinking rather than narrative management belongs to everyone in a position of responsibility tonight, and the obligation to demand that seriousness belongs to every citizen paying attention. The alliance solidarity question will receive enormous attention in the coming days, and I want to frame it correctly before the public conversation shapes around framing that obscures more than it reveals. Alliance solidarity, after a shock of this magnitude, is not demonstrated by communiques expressing unanimous condemnation. Communiques are words. Alliance solidarity is demonstrated by decisions about defense investment, about force posture, about the deployment of specific military capabilities to specific locations at specific timelines that carry real costs for the governments making them. Germany's decision about its defense budget trajectory, France's decision about the deployment of its independent military capabilities in coordination with alliance planning, the Baltic states' decisions about the civilian and military infrastructure investments required to sustain extended defense under contested conditions, those decisions are where alliance solidarity will be demonstrated or found wanting in the months ahead. I will be watching those decisions with the attention they deserve, and so should you. The window for the decisions that matter is shorter than the political conversation will suggest, and the cost of missing it is larger than anyone in a position of comfort tonight wants to acknowledge. Let me close with a direct assessment of where this situation is likely to go over the next 30 days, because analysis that stops at describing the problem without projecting its trajectory is incomplete. The most probable near-term outcome is a NATO Article 5 declaration of collective defense that falls short of authorizing offensive military action against Russian territory, accompanied by specific decisions to accelerate air defense capability deployment to the most exposed alliance members and to impose additional economic costs on Russia through expanded sanctions. That outcome will be presented as a unified and decisive response. It will be an insufficient response to the strategic challenge that tonight has revealed, and it will be insufficient because the political constraints I have described throughout this analysis are real constraints that cannot be wished away by the language of communiques. What tonight demonstrated is that the deterrence architecture requires reconstruction, not repair, and reconstruction requires honesty about the scale of what needs to be built and the timeline on which it needs to be built. That honesty is the starting point and the obligation of anyone who takes seriously what happened in the skies over Poland and Romania in the early hours of this morning.